The thing that will bother you most isn't that I survived. It's that I knew, not in the way people now claim they knew. The retrospective certainty of survivors rewriting their own timeline, inserting foresight into what was actually just ordinary anxiety. I had a date, not a precise one, but a window. A 9-week corridor between late October and late December, inside which I believed, based on evidence I'd been assembling for 14 months, that a pathogen event would breach civilian containment in at least 2 major North American population centers simultaneously. I had written this down. I had a folder on my laptop, dated entries, a methodology. I was not guessing. If you're curious how someone could see the end coming and still be powerless to stop it, subscribe before we go further. And if you're listening right now, tell me in the comments where you are. My name is Soren Volk. I was 32, a data analyst for a mid-sized pharmaceutical logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. My job was pattern recognition. Specifically, tracking anomalies and supply chain data that indicated demand spikes at the regional distributor level. When hospitals started ordering unusual volumes of a specific class of antiviral in an unusual geographic cluster, I was one of the first non-medical professionals in the country to see the signal. I reported it to my supervisor in August of the previous year. He told me I was extrapolating beyond the data. He wasn't wrong, technically. I was extrapolating. I just happened to extrapolate correctly. I did not tell anyone else at work. I did not post online. I went home and I started building. The shelter was in the basement of a house I had purchased 18 months earlier. A 1960s ranch on a half-acre lot in a semi-rural area 22 miles west of Columbus. I had bought it for reasons I told myself were financial, and which were, on reflection, motivated entirely by the part of my brain that was already running contingency calculations. The basement was unfinished, accessible only through an interior door off the utility hallway, with a separate exterior egress window that I converted in the shelter's 3rd month into a secondary access point. I spent 6 months turning it into something that could sustain 2 people for 4 months. Reinforced door, ventilation system, water storage, food cache, medical supplies, power independent from the grid. 2 people. I had built it for 2. The second person was my younger brother, Nanny. He was 26, a line cook at a restaurant downtown. Funny in the specific way of people who have learned to use humor as social currency and have gotten very good at the exchange rate. He did not know about the shelter. I had not told him because I knew, with the same certainty I had applied to the pathogen data, that Danny would tell me I was losing my mind. Gently, affectionately, in the way he did everything, and that the conversation would cost me something I wasn't willing to spend. So I built in secret and I waited, and I planned to call him when the window opened and tell him to come immediately and explain everything in the car on the way. The window opened on a Thursday. I called Danny at 7:14 a.m. He answered on the 4th ring, still half asleep, and I told him to get in his car right now and drive to my house. I told him not to stop for anything. I told him I would explain when he arrived. He said, "Soren, it's Thursday." I said, "I know what day it is." He said, "Is this the thing you've been?" I said, "Yes, it's the thing. Drive now." There was a pause, the kind of pause that contains a decision. Then I heard him moving. Danny lived 14 miles from me. In normal Thursday morning traffic, the drive was 25 minutes. I know this because I had calculated it. I had calculated everything. That was the problem, and the advantage simultaneously. And I stood at my front window with my phone in my hand and watched the street and waited. At 7:52 a.m., 38 minutes after I called him, I saw the first infected person I had ever seen. She was walking down the center of my street. Her gait was wrong in a way I recognized immediately, not from experience, but from the supply chain data, the anomalies, the cluster of antiviral orders that had told me something was coming before anyone with authority had been willing to say so. Danny had 6 more minutes of clear road ahead of him, probably. Danny arrived at 7:58 a.m., driving 40 miles an hour on a residential street, which told me he had seen something on the way. He came through the front door without knocking. I had left it unlocked. And the first thing he said was not a question. He said, "There was a man on Hendricks Avenue, just standing in the road." I went around him, and he didn't move. I said, "I know. Come in. Close the door." He looked at me. Danny had a face that was constitutionally incapable of concealing what it was processing, which was both his most endearing quality and the reason I had never been able to lie to him successfully about anything that mattered. He was looking at me now with the expression I recognized as the one preceding his most direct statements. Brow slightly contracted, the humor stripped away. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, 14 months. He held that for a moment. Then he said, "And you didn't tell me?" It wasn't a question either. That was the thing about Danny. He very rarely asked questions he already knew the answer to. He stated his conclusions and let you respond to them, which was a more honest form of conversation than most people managed. I said, "Come downstairs. I'll show you everything." The shelter, when I brought Danny down for the first time, had the effect I had anticipated and not let myself fully think through. He stood at the reinforced door and looked at the interior. The organized shelving, the water storage, the medical kit on its dedicated wall mount, the 2 sleeping platforms I had built on opposite sides of the room. And he was quiet for longer than Danny was usually quiet. When he spoke, his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. Not anger, something more complicated. He said, "You built this for me." I said, "I built it for both of us." He said, "But you made 2 beds." I said, "Yes." He said, "Without telling me." I said, "If I'd told you." He said, "I know what I would have said. I know exactly what I would have said." He turned and looked at me directly. "That doesn't mean you shouldn't have told me." I had prepared for many conversations about the shelter. I had not prepared for this one, which I realized was because it was the conversation I most needed to have and had been most carefully avoiding. Before I could answer, the power went out. Not a fluctuation, a complete cessation. The kind where the ambient hum of appliances you've stopped hearing becomes audible only in its absence. The basement's emergency lighting activated immediately. The battery-backed LED strips I'd installed along the ceiling perimeter, casting everything in a flat, even white. Danny looked up at the lights, and then looked at me and said, with something close to dark humor, "You prepared for that too?" I said, "I prepared for a lot of things." He said, "Did you prepare for the fact that Mom is 40 minutes from here and has no idea what's happening?" I had not prepared for that, not in the way that mattered. I had acknowledged my mother's existence in the contingency plan. She lived in Westerville, 41 minutes on a normal day. And I had told myself that 41 minutes was within range, and that when the time came, I would assess the road situation and make a decision based on current conditions. That was the language I'd used to myself. Assess and decide. It was the language of someone who had built an elaborate analytical framework around a choice he could not bring himself to make in advance. The choice was this. The shelter held 4 months of supplies for 2 people. My mother would make 3. 3 people cut the runway to under 3 months, which by my original calculations was inside the minimum viable window. I had known this. I had built 2 beds anyway. I had called Danny and not called my mother. Danny was still looking at me. He already knew what my silence meant. He said, "Soren." I said, "The roads are going to deteriorate fast." He said, "I know that." I said, 41 minutes is... He said, "She's our mother." The shelter hummed around us, powered and sealed and sufficient for exactly the number of people I had chosen to account for. Outside, somewhere on my street, there was a woman with a wrong gait moving through the ordinary Thursday morning of a world that had just run out of ordinary. I picked up my car keys. Danny said, I'm coming with you. My mother's name is Elsa Valk, and she is the most pragmatic person I have ever known, which made what came next both easier and harder than it would have been with someone else. The drive to Westerville took 53 minutes, not 41, because by 8:30 a.m., the surface roads had acquired a texture of disorder that demanded constant rerouting. Not chaos yet. Not the images you've seen since. The ones that defined the visual language of that first day. Just wrongness in the peripheral vision. A car stopped at a green light. A man on a front lawn doing nothing. A dog running loose with nobody calling after it. Danny sat in the passenger seat and tracked each anomaly without speaking, the way he used to track scores during games. Precisely, keeping his own internal count. I had the radio on. The morning show hosts had stopped doing the morning show and were reading statements in the measured cadence of people who had been handed a script and told to stay calm, and were succeeding at the first instruction, but not the second. The language was managed. Reported incidents, isolated to specific areas, authorities responding. But the edges of the composure were fraying in real time. By the time we reached the 270 interchange, a different voice had taken over. Flatter, more official, less human. Danny said, "She's going to ask how you knew." I said, "I know." He said, "What are you going to tell her?" I said, "The truth." He turned to look at me. The whole truth? I understood the question. The whole truth included the part where I'd spent 6 months building a shelter that held 2 people, during which time I'd called our mother regularly and talked about work and the Columbus Blue Jackets and whether she needed her gutters cleaned, and had said nothing. The whole truth included the specific calculation I had made about supply margins and the specific conclusion I had reached, and the specific action I had taken in response to that conclusion, which was to build 2 beds and not 3. I said, "Yes." Danny said, "Okay." That was it. One word, flat and final, the way Danny issued his verdicts. He wasn't forgiving me. He was telling me that he had decided to continue, and that the decision was made, and that we could examine the rest later when later existed. My mother was in her kitchen when we arrived. She had the television on, the official voice, the flat managed language, and she was drinking coffee, which meant she was processing rather than panicking, because my mother's response to any crisis was to make coffee and sit with it until she had completed her assessment. She looked at us when we came through the door with the expression of someone who has been expecting an interruption and has already decided how to receive it. She said, "How bad?" I said, "Bad. You need to come with us now." She said, "I need shoes and my medication. Give me 4 minutes." She was back in 3, with a packed bag that told me she had already been preparing one, which meant she had been watching the news more carefully than she had let on in our recent calls, and had arrived at her own assessment independently. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or implicated. She looked at me and said, "You knew before this morning." I said, "Yes." She said, "We'll talk about it later." Then she looked at Danny. "Is he all right?" Danny said, "I'm right here, Mom." She said, "I know where you are." But she put her hand on his arm for a moment, the way she did when she was checking that a thing she valued was still intact. The drive back was 38 minutes, because I knew a route avoiding the main arterials, which I knew because I had driven it 3 times in the previous month under the pretense of visiting a hardware store that was, in fact, close to my house, and not close to Westerville at all. My mother sat in the back seat and did not ask about the route discrepancy. When she saw the shelter for the first time, she did the same thing Danny had done, stood at the door and looked in silence. Then she said, "2 beds." I said, "I'll build a 3rd. She said, "Yes, you will." Her voice was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the voice of a woman recalibrating the information she had about her son. "Night, if we have time. Tomorrow, if we don't." She walked inside and put her bag on the floor between the 2 sleeping platforms and sat down on the edge of one of them. She looked around at everything I had built and said nothing else about the beds or the number of them. And the silence she maintained about it was a more precise form of judgment than any sentence she could have constructed. Danny sat down across from her. I stood at the door. Neither of them looked at me like I had saved them. The third bed took 4 hours to build, which I know because Danny timed it. Not to pressure me, but because Danny had always been someone who kept track of durations. How long a thing took was information to him, meaningful in the way that all accurate data was meaningful. My mother spent those 4 hours doing an inventory. She moved through the shelter's storage with a systematic focus that I recognized as her own form of crisis competence. She had been an ER intake coordinator for 11 years, which meant she had a professionally calibrated ability to assess what was present, what was missing, and what the gap between them meant in practical terms. When I finished the bed and looked up, she had a handwritten list on a notepad she had taken from my supply stack. She said, "You have enough food. Your water storage is good. Your medical kit is missing 2 things I consider essential. And I'll tell you what they are. Your ventilation will need to be checked every 72 hours, or the filter degrades faster than you've accounted for." She paused. "You did this well, Soren." I said, "But..." She said, "I didn't say but." I said, "You were about to." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You spent 6 months preparing a place of safety for yourself and your brother, and you did not tell me. That is a thing I'm going to need to understand. But I said you did this well, and I meant it. And those are 2 separate statements, and I'm capable of holding them both." Danny said from across the room, "That's the most terrifying sentence I've ever heard." My mother said, "Good, eat something." We had our first meal in the shelter that evening, canned soup heated on the small propane unit I'd installed in the ventilation alcove, eaten in the flat light of the LED strips with the sound of nothing in particular coming through the ceiling. The house above us was empty and dark. Somewhere outside, the Thursday that had started like any other Thursday was completing its transformation into something that would require new language to describe. I had a battery radio on the supply shelf. I turned it on after dinner. The official voice had given way to something more fragmented. Multiple stations, some maintaining broadcast, some already silent. The ones still running, carrying information that had stopped being managed and started being urgent. A shelter-in-place advisory. A list of addresses for designated community gathering points, read out twice and then not repeated, as though the person reading it had realized mid-broadcast that the addresses were no longer relevant. My mother listened with her eyes closed, not sleeping, processing. Danny sat beside her with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor in the way he stared at things when he was thinking hard. He said, "Lena." I said, "What?" He said, "Lena Park. She lives 2 blocks from here. She was going to come over tonight. We had plans." He looked up. I didn't call her. I had been waiting for this. Not Lena specifically. I didn't know about Lena, which was a separate data point about what Danny hadn't been telling me. In the same period, I hadn't been telling him things. But for the moment when the shelter stopped being a closed system and someone on the outside acquired a name, I said, "Does she have somewhere to go?" Danny said, "I don't know. I don't know what she has." He took out his phone. The cell network was degraded but not gone. He dialed. It rang several times and went to voicemail, and the look on his face when it did was the first genuinely frightened expression I had seen from him since he'd walked through my front door. He said, "I'm going to keep trying." I said, "Okay." My mother opened her eyes. She looked at Danny, then at me. She said nothing, but the shelter, which I had designed as a closed and sufficient system, had just developed its first structural crack. Not in the walls, not in the ventilation, but in the way we were all now thinking about the people outside them. Danny reached Lena on the second day. She was in her apartment, 2 blocks away, with her roommate Priya and Priya's boyfriend Marcus, 3 people who had been awake since the first night, monitoring their building's entrance, rationing the food in their kitchen with a discipline that Danny said, when he relayed the call to me, sounded like controlled terror performing as calm. Danny handed me the phone mid-conversation. Lena's voice was composed and direct. She had assessed her situation and was reporting it rather than asking to be rescued, which told me something about her that I filed alongside that everything else I was filing about people I was being forced to understand quickly. She said they had food for approximately 8 days. She said the building had 15 units, and at least 6 of them were occupied by people she could account for. She said she was not asking to come to us, and she was not asking us to come to them. She said, "I'm calling because Danny needed to know I was okay. I'm okay. I just wanted him to know." I said, "There may be a point where we can help in some way. Stay on this frequency." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I don't know yet what it means. But stay reachable." Danny took the phone back. He and Lena talked for 3 more minutes, and I went to the supply wall and stood in front of it and did math I didn't want to do. 3 people, 4 months. That was the original architecture. We were now 3 people plus the knowledge of 6 more 2 blocks away, with 8 days of food between them, and a cell network that was degrading by the hour. My mother came to stand beside me. She said, "You're doing the calculation?" I said, "I've already done it." She said, "And?" I told her the honest numbers. 3 people, 4 months of reserves. If we brought 3 more in, we had food for approximately 6 weeks. If we brought all 6, we had food for 3 weeks. Inside the window, potentially survivable, but compressing every margin I had built. She said, "Those are numbers. What's the question?" I said the question was whether we opened the shelter to people we knew were in danger, when doing so materially reduced our own survivable window. She said, "That's not a question. That's an arithmetic problem dressed as one." I said, "What's the difference?" She said, "A question has more than one defensible answer." She walked back to her sleeping platform and picked up the notepad with the inventory. She added a line to it. I saw her writing, but couldn't read it from where I was standing, and set it back down. She did not tell me what she had written. I went back to Danny. He was off the phone, sitting on the 3rd bed I had built, turning his phone over in his hands. He said, "I know what you're going to say." I said, "Then you know I'm right." He said, "You're right about the numbers. You're not right about everything." There was a distinction in that sentence that I needed to sit with. Danny made distinctions the way engineers made load calculations, precisely, with the understanding that the difference between 2 structurally similar things could be, under the right conditions, the difference between standing and collapse. He was telling me that being numerically correct about supply margins was a different category of correctness than the one that mattered most in what we were actually deciding. I said, "What would you do?" He said, "I'd bring them in, not because the numbers work, because they're people and we have a door." I said, 3 weeks of food for 6 people is not a plan." He said, "No, it's a starting point." The shelter hummed. Upstairs, my house was dark and silent. 2 blocks away, 6 people were rationing food in an apartment building and waiting to see what the world decided to do next. I had built this place for 2 people, and I was already in it with 3. And the 4th and 5th and 6th were already present in every conversation we were having, even though they were still on the other side of a wall. I picked up the phone and called Lena back. They came the next morning. Lena, Priya, and Marcus, which meant 3 more people and the immediate practical problem of 3 more sleeping arrangements in a space I had designed for 2. Lena was not what I had constructed from Danny's references to her. I had built, without realizing it, a vague impression formed from second-hand information, and the person who came through my basement door was specific in a way that impressions never are. She was 28, a physical therapist, with a particular observational quality of someone trained to read bodies. She scanned the shelter in the first 30 seconds with the competence of a professional doing a site assessment. not a frightened person seeking reassurance. She looked at me and said, "Danny said you built this." I said, "Yes." She said, "What's the weight capacity on those sleeping platforms?" I told her. She nodded and began measuring the remaining floor space with her eyes. Estimating, I realized, where additional sleeping surfaces could be placed. Priya was quieter. She was a graduate student in chemistry, which I learned because she went directly to the medical kit, examined it with focused attention, and asked me 2 specific questions about the pharmaceutical storage conditions that indicated she understood more about the subject than most people who weren't medical professionals. Marcus was a large, deliberate man who said very little and spent his first 2 hours in the shelter moving between the structural features of the room with a builder's attention, checking the reinforced door, examining the ventilation port, placing his hand against the walls at various points in a way that told me he had construction experience and was assessing what I'd built for integrity rather than comfort. He said eventually, "This is solid work." I said, "Thank you." He said, "The secondary egress is your weak point. The frame is right, but the seal won't hold in a sustained pressure situation." I said, "I know. I ran out of time." He said, "I can fix it. Do you have materials?" I did. Marcus spent the rest of the day fixing the secondary egress seal, and the specific feeling of watching someone improve something I had built was one I hadn't anticipated. Not the pride I expected, but something more complicated. Gratitude mixed with the recognition that my construction, which I had evaluated as sufficient, had blind spots that other competencies could see. Danny and Lena sat together on his sleeping platform and talked in the quiet way of people who have more to say than the situation allows for. My mother watched them with the expression she wore at family gatherings when she was pleased about something she wasn't going to announce. Priya reorganized the pharmaceutical section of the medical kit with my permission, and her reorganization was demonstrably better than the original arrangement. By the end of that day, 6 people occupied a space I had built for 2, and the space was working. Not comfortably. There was a friction of proximity that I had no engineering solution for. But functionally, everyone had found something to contribute to, and the contributions were filling gaps that the original design had left open. I sat against the supply wall that evening and looked at the room. My mother caught my eye from across it. She tilted her head very slightly in the direction of the sleeping platforms. At Danny and Lena, at Priya cross-referencing her chemical knowledge against the supply labels, at Marcus testing the secondary egress seal he had just improved. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The notepad on her platform, the one with the inventory she had amended, was face up. I could read the line she had added now. It said, "Capacity is not a ceiling. It's a starting assumption." I read it twice. Then I looked at the supply wall and started revising every calculation I had made in the previous 14 months. On the 6th day, someone knocked on the exterior egress, not the front door. The basement exterior window I had converted to a secondary access point, which opened to the side yard and which virtually no one should have known existed. 3 knocks. Deliberate, with the specific weight of a person who is afraid but has decided that being afraid is not a sufficient reason not to knock. Every person in the shelter heard it. The room went very still in the way rooms go still when multiple people simultaneously decide to be quiet and the decision is unanimous and instantaneous. I looked at Marcus, who was closest to the egress. He looked back at me. Lena put her hand on Danny's arm. I said quietly, "Who knows about this door?" Nobody answered, which meant nobody knew, which meant either someone had found it by accident, surveying the house's exterior looking for entry points, or someone knew something about the house's construction that I hadn't accounted for. I went to the egress and put my ear against the seal Marcus had repaired and listened. Breathing, faint and uneven. Human. Then a man's voice, rough with cold and something else. Something that sounded like it had been held back for a while and was beginning to loosen. "Soren, it's Paul Whitmer. From work. Paul Whitmer. I cataloged him immediately. 39, senior data analyst. 2 desks from mine for 3 years. A man I'd eaten lunch with probably 200 times and talked to about work and sports and the ordinary geography of shared professional space. He had a wife. I thought her name was Karen. He had a dog. He jogged on Tuesdays and Thursdays on a route that took him past the eastern edge of my neighborhood. He was at my basement door. I looked at the room. 6 faces looking back at me, all of them doing their own calculation, all of them already understanding what I was about to have to decide. Paul said, "I know you're in there. I've been watching the house for 2 days. I saw you go in. I saw you not come out." A pause. "I'm not sick. I lost Karen on the 2nd day. I don't have anywhere." His voice did something at the edges that he couldn't control. "I'm alone out here, Soren." I knew Paul. I knew him in the way you know a colleague. Not deeply, not with the intimacy of chosen relationship, but with the specific familiarity of shared ordinary time. I knew he took his coffee black. I knew he was patient and methodical, and that he had once, during a particularly bad audit quarter, covered a significant portion of my workload without being asked and without mentioning it. I knew he was a decent person by every observable measure available to me. I also knew that we had food for approximately 4 weeks with 6 people, and with 7 people we had less than that. And my original margin calculation was already a memory. Danny said, "Low. Soren." I said, "I know." He said, "What do you know?" I said, "I know what the right answer is." He said, "Then why are you still standing there?" Because knowing the right answer and being able to execute it without cost were different cognitive events, and the distance between them was the specific space in which I had been living for 6 days. Every person I had let through a door had made the next door harder to close and also harder to keep closed. And Paul Whitmer was not a moral abstraction on the other side of the egress. He was a man who took black coffee and covered other people's workloads without mentioning it, and who had lost his wife on the 2nd day. I opened the door. Paul came through it and immediately sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and put his face in his hands. Past crying, into the territory beyond it, where the body has exhausted its expressive capacity and simply goes still. He stayed like that for a full minute. Nobody spoke. Lena, after a moment, sat down beside him on the floor, not touching him, just proximate, a physical communication of presence that didn't require anything from him in return. Danny looked at me across the room. His expression was not triumphant. It was the expression of a person watching someone he loves do something costly in the right direction. My mother picked up her notepad and added another line. Paul had information we didn't. He had been moving through the neighborhood for 2 days before he came to us, which meant he had seen the surface situation with a clarity that our sealed shelter had deliberately denied us. He described it in the flat, careful way of someone who had been rehearsing how to communicate what he'd seen without communicating it in the way it had actually landed on him. The infected were not numerous in our immediate area yet. They were present. He had seen 11 in 2 days, moving singly or in pairs, with the deliberate, unhurried quality that was becoming the defining characteristic of this particular catastrophe. They were drawn to noise and movement, he confirmed, and they did not appear to perceive through glass or walls in any way that he had observed. What he had observed, instead, was their persistence. He had watched one stand motionless at the corner of Maple and Hendricks for 4 hours without any apparent stimulus or purpose, as though the concept of waiting had been retained after everything else was stripped out. The neighborhood itself was approximately 60% evacuated. People had taken the shelter-in-place advisory seriously for the first 12 hours, and then abandoned it as the information environment collapsed, and the instinct to move overwhelmed the instruction to stay. Those who remained were doing so either by choice or because they lacked the means to leave. Paul said, "The Hendersons are still there. He meant the family 3 houses down, a couple in their 50s named Ray and Donna, with their adult son Cam, who had some kind of developmental disability, and who Paul knew better than I did because Paul jogged past their house twice a week and had developed the easy familiarity of repeated proximity. He said, "Cam was in the yard yesterday morning, just standing there. Donna was at the window." I said, "Were they okay?" He said, "Physically, I think so." Donna looked. He stopped, started again. She looked like someone waiting for a decision to be made for her. The shelter had 7 people in it. My supply calculation, revised for the 3rd time, gave us approximately 22 days at current consumption, assuming no significant waste. 22 days was not nothing. It was also not a plan. I had stopped thinking of it as a plan 2 days earlier. What I was doing now, and what I was only beginning to admit I was doing, was something different from the original architecture of my intention. I had built a sealed system for 2 specific people. What I was running now was something closer to an operation, dynamic, consuming resources at a rate determined not by my original calculation, but by the specific moral logic of a door I couldn't close once I'd learned there was someone on the other side of it who needed it open. Marcus said, "The Hendersons have a garage. Cam's been working on something in there for a year. I've seen him. A generator setup, I think, or something like it." I said, "You know them?" He said, "I do electrical work around the neighborhood. Ray hired me for a panel upgrade last spring." He paused. "They're good people. Cam is. He's good. He's just different." Priya said, from the medical section, "If we're going to expand, we should do it before we further deplete the reserve. Bringing more people in on day 20 is worse than bringing them in on day 7. The room absorbed this. It was the correct analysis. Priya made correct analysis the way other people made small talk, reflexively and without apparent effort. She had not framed it as a recommendation. She had framed it as a logical observation, which meant the recommendation was implicit, and everyone in the room was the one making it. I said, "I'm not going to take a vote." Danny said, "Why not?" I said, "Because if we vote and the vote is to leave them, I'll have made everyone here complicit in a decision that should be mine alone." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. It was the silence of people recognizing a specific form of integrity in a statement they might not fully agree with. The integrity of a person accepting the weight of a unilateral choice rather than distributing it. My mother said, "Go get them." Paul came with me because he knew the route and I didn't. We went out through the secondary egress at 05:30, when the light was low enough to provide cover but present enough to navigate by. The air outside was cold in the specific way of early November mornings, with a ground fog sitting in the low spaces between the houses. I had not been outside for 6 days, and the scale of the world. Even this small residential world of half-acre lots and detached garages felt disproportionate after the shelter's dimensions. Everything was larger than it should have been. Paul moved with the practiced economy of someone who had been doing this for 2 days and had learned by doing. He kept to fence lines and building shadows. He communicated with hand gestures, and I followed his lead without question, because this was his expertise now, and I was the newcomer to the surface. We saw 2 infected in the 3-minute transit to the Hendersons. Both were at distance, one near the end of the block, facing away from us, standing with the particular stillness Paul had described. The second was moving slowly north on the far side of the street, heading away. Paul watched both of them with a focused attention that was not fear. It was assessment. He had moved through this world for 2 days and developed a functional model of its behavior, and he was applying it with the same methodical precision he'd brought to audit data at a desk 2 feet from mine. Ray Henderson answered his back door before we knocked. He had been watching the yard. He was a compact, careful man, with the bearing of someone who had spent his professional life making measured decisions under pressure. Danny had told me he was a recently retired fire chief, which explained the bearing. He looked at us and then looked past us at the yard and said, "Come in fast." The Hendersons' house was organized in a specific way that told a story immediately. Food consolidated in the kitchen, medication in a bag by the door, go bags for 3 people already packed and staged in the utility room. Ray had been preparing to move. He was waiting for a direction, not a decision. Donna was in the kitchen. She was managing. That was the word for it, the same word Lena had used about herself on the phone. And I was beginning to understand that managing was the universal description of a specific interior state, functional, forward-moving, and containing something that would need to be dealt with later, in a later that might not come. Cam was in the garage. Ray said, "He won't leave it. I've tried. He's been working on something since this started and he says it's not done." I went to the garage. Cam was 24, broad-shouldered, with the focused intensity of someone who thinks about one thing at a time and thinks about it with their whole mind. He was wiring something. A compact, custom-built power unit. Its components arrayed on the workbench with a neatness that was aesthetic in its precision. He looked up at me when I came in and said, "Battery array. 4 marine deep cycle units, series parallel configuration. Should give you about a week of low-draw operation before it needs recharging." He looked back at his work. "I need 20 more minutes." I said, "We have time." He said, "No, we don't. But 20 minutes is what it takes." I left him to it and went back to Ray. I told him about the shelter in enough detail for him to assess it accurately. He asked 2 questions, structural and supply. That confirmed the fire chief instinct for load-bearing information. He said, "We'll bring what we can carry." 23 minutes later, Cam came in from the garage carrying the battery array in a configuration that distributed its weight across a custom frame he had built for exactly this purpose. He had clearly been building the frame at the same time as the array, which meant he had already planned to move it. He just hadn't been ready. He said, "This goes with us. It'll solve your power problem." I said, "I don't have a power problem yet." He said, "You will." We made it back to the shelter in 4 minutes. 10 people now. The basement holding a density of human presence I'd never designed for, and which was working anyway. Cam set the battery array down in the equipment corner and began integrating it with my existing power setup, with a focus that excluded everything else in the room. Ray looked around at the shelter, at the organized shelves, at the people distributed across the space. He looked at me and said, "You built this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Before all this?" I said, "Yes." He processed that for a moment. Then he said, "Smart and lucky." I said, "The smart part was intentional." He said, "The lucky part is that you opened the door." On day 11, I made the decision that I've spent every subsequent day examining from every angle available to me, and which I still cannot evaluate with the certainty I apply to most things. There were people in the house 2 doors north. I knew this because Marcus had seen movement in the upper window during a perimeter check. Cautious, brief movement, the kind made by people who have learned that visibility was risk, but who couldn't stop themselves from checking the world outside. He reported it to me with the care he brought to all structural observations, factual, specific, without recommendation. 10 people in the shelter. Supply calculation revised to 13 days at current consumption. 13 days was inside the minimum viable window by the methodology I had originally constructed. It was not inside the minimum viable window by any revision of that methodology I had made. Since the day my mother sat down on the 3rd bed I had built and looked at me with a particular judgment of accurate information, the house 2 doors north contained an unknown number of people in an unknown state of resource depletion. Adding even 2 people to our current count reduced the supply runway to approximately 9 days. 9 days was not survivable by any methodology, original or revised. I had this conversation with myself alone, because I had promised Danny I would accept the full weight of unilateral decisions, and this one was the one that the promise had been made for. The arithmetic was unambiguous. 13 days was a number. 9 days was a smaller number. I had built a shelter. I had done the math. The math had a clear answer. I went and found Ray. I told him about the house 2 doors north. I told him the supply calculation at current count and the revised calculation if we expanded further. I told him I had not told anyone else and was not going to take a vote. Ray listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "What are you asking me?" I said, "I'm asking whether a fire chief would let a building burn because the water supply was limited." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A fire chief makes decisions about which buildings to save and which to let go when the resource situation demands triage. That's a real thing that happens. It doesn't feel the way people think it feels." I said, "How does it feel?" He said, "Like arithmetic, right up until it doesn't." I said, "What makes it stop feeling like arithmetic?" He said, "When you find out who's in the building." I looked at him. He looked back at me. He said, "Go find out who's in the building, Soren. Then make the decision." I went out through the secondary egress alone. 2 doors north, a house with a light in the upper window. I crossed the yards in the gray morning, with my heart running faster than my pace warranted, and knocked on the back door. A woman opened it. 50s, clear-eyed, a hospital lanyard around her neck that she hadn't taken off, which told me the lanyard still meant something to her, that the identity it represented was still load-bearing. She said, "Are you from the neighborhood?" I said, "I have a shelter, 2 doors south. We have food, water, power." She said, "How many people?" I said, 10. We have room for more." The sentence came out before I'd finished deciding to say it. She said, "There are 6 of us here." She paused. 4 of them are patients. I'm a home health nurse. I was making rounds when this started, and I couldn't. I just couldn't leave them. 4 patients, unknown medical requirements, unknown mobility, 4 people who existed at the extreme end of every supply calculation I had ever made. I stood at the back door of a stranger's house, and I looked at this woman with her hospital lanyard and her 4 patients, and I did the math one more time. The math said no. I said, "Come with us." Her name was Beatrice, and she had kept 4 people alive for 11 days on the contents of a suburban kitchen and her own professional knowledge, which was a form of engineering I had not previously considered equivalent to my own, and which I updated my assessment of immediately. The 4 patients were an 81-year-old man named Harold, who was post-surgical and mobile with a walker, a woman named Gwen, 67, diabetic, whose insulin supply was Beatrice's primary ongoing crisis, a 30-year-old man named Darius, who had a traumatic brain injury from a pre-outbreak accident, and who communicated through a tablet-based interface that he carried in a padded case he would not surrender to anyone, and a 14-year-old girl named Sophie, whose mother had brought her to the home health agency's emergency line on the first day and then not returned, and whose medical condition was, according to Beatrice, stable and manageable, but whose psychological state was the thing that required the most active attention. 16 people in a basement shelter built for 2. Priya's pharmaceutical knowledge became immediately and critically relevant in the context of Gwen's insulin. The supply Beatrice had brought was not adequate for more than 5 days, and Priya, working from memory and from the chemistry principles she applied with the same ease Marcus applied structural ones, identified a potential bridge protocol that bought Gwen additional time while we figured out the longer problem. It was not a solution. It was a delay of the crisis, which was the most honest form of solution available. Darius communicated primarily through text on his tablet, which he did with speed and precision that indicated his cognitive function was intact in the ways that mattered most for survival, and that he was aware of the gap between his communication speed and others, which he bridged by being more economical with words than anyone else in the room. His first communication to me, after Beatrice introduced us, was a single line on the screen. "Who's in charge here?" I said, "Unclear." He typed for 2 seconds. The screen said, "That's honest. I'll work with that. Harold, who was 81 and post-surgical and moved slowly and had been through things that predated everything I knew about the world, sat down in the corner Cam had designated as the equipment area and spent 20 minutes watching Cam work on the power integration. Then he said, "My son builds electronics. I used to watch him the same way. I never understood it either, but I liked watching," Cam said without looking up. "I can explain it if you want." Harold said, "How long would it take?" Cam said, "As long as you want." Harold said, "Then yes." Sophie was the last one I spoke to on the second day after the transfer. She was 14, and she had not said anything to anyone since arriving, and she sat against the wall near Danny's sleeping platform with her knees drawn up and her eyes tracking every movement in the room with the specific attention of someone who has learned that attention is a form of protection. Danny had been careful around her, not hovering, not performing comfort, but ensuring that his presence in her physical vicinity was consistent and non-demanding, which told me something about Danny that I had apparently needed 16 days of crisis to fully observe. I sat down near her, not beside her, at an angle, the way Lena had sat near Paul, and said, "You don't have to talk." She said nothing. I said, "I built this place before I knew any of these people would be in it. I don't entirely know how to explain that." She said, quietly, not looking at me, "You built it because you were scared." I said, "Yes." She said, "But then you kept opening the door." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I thought about it honestly, in the way I tried to think about everything. Then I said, "Because the people on the other side of it kept turning out to be real." Sophie looked at me, 14 years old, and she had just received the most honest answer I had ever given to a question about my own behavior. She held it for a moment. Then she turned back to the room and went on watching, and I went back to the supply wall to revise the calculation one more time. The insulin crisis became concrete on day 19. Priya's bridge protocol had extended Gwen's supply by 9 days, which was a significant achievement that had cost Priya 4 nights of partial sleep and 3 days of systematic cross-referencing between her chemical knowledge and every reference document we had in the shelter. On day 19, the extended supply ran its course, and Gwen's blood glucose began to climb in a way that Beatrice tracked with a glucometer she'd brought and monitored with the focused attention of someone watching a structural indicator they can read but cannot currently act on. I'd been thinking about insulin for 9 days. I'd been thinking about the pharmacy on Hendricks Avenue, 3 blocks from the house, a standard retail chain pharmacy with a temperature-controlled storage unit for biologics, and what was likely still in it, and what the probability was of reaching it and returning without an encounter that went badly. Marcus had looked at the pharmacy's exterior on his last perimeter check. He'd come back and drawn a sketch of the approach on the notepad my mother had been using for inventory, annotating it with his builder's precision, sight lines, potential cover positions, the condition of the entrance. He had not said anything explicit about why he was providing this information. He had put the sketch on the supply table and returned to his work. Ray had looked at the sketch. Darius had looked at the sketch from across the room and typed, "2-person approach. Stay along the east building line. The pharmacy's backup generator may still be running. It would have been triggered by the grid failure. If it's running, the refrigerated storage is intact." I had read Darius's analysis and recognized it as correct, with the specific recognition of one analytical mind identifying another's methodology. Paul said, "I know that area. I've jogged past it 100 times. There's a delivery alley on the north side that provides cover for the last 40 meters. I looked at the sketch. I looked at the room. Gwen was in the corner with Beatrice, and her color was not good. And Beatrice was monitoring her with the focused calm that was its own kind of alarm. The calm of a professional who has exhausted the alternatives available without external resources and is now simply maintaining the patient's comfort while waiting for something to change. I said to Ray, "I need someone who knows how to move." He said, "I'm going with you." Danny said, 3 is better than 2. I looked at him. He was already tying his boot. I said, Danny. He said, I've been in here 19 days. I know what I'm doing. I said, you don't know what you're doing. None of us know what we're doing. He said, that's my point. You don't get to decide who takes the risk just because you built the room we're standing in. The room was quiet. Lena was watching Danny with an expression I didn't have full access to. My mother was watching me with the expression she had shown me every time I had made a decision she wanted me to arrive at on my own. I said, 3. We left through the secondary egress at 0600. The fog was heavy, and the temperature had dropped further, which was a tactical advantage in the way that bad weather was always a tactical advantage for those who were prepared for it over those who were not. Paul's delivery alley was exactly as described. The pharmacy's backup generator was running. We were inside for 11 minutes. Ray found the insulin storage with the directness of someone who had done search and recover operations in burning buildings and had applied the same systematic logic to a darkened pharmacy. Danny stood at the door and watched the street with a steadiness I found both reassuring and difficult to name. The way you sometimes can't find the word for a quality in someone you love, because the quality has always been there and you've been seeing it without categorizing it. We came back with insulin for 60 days, if rationed carefully, along with several other items Beatrice had listed on a priority card she'd pressed into my hand before we left. Gwen's glucose was back inside safe range by evening. Beatrice said, thank you. I said, Priya bought us the time. Darius found the approach. She said, you went. I said, yes. She held my eyes for a moment. She said, that's the part that matters. On day 27, we found a signal. Darius had been working on the radio setup. My original battery-backed unit supplemented by the components Cam had integrated, and had extended its range significantly through a modification I couldn't have designed myself but recognized as elegant once I understood what he'd done. He presented it to the room at 900 by simply turning it on and cycling to a frequency he'd identified through passive monitoring. And a voice came through. Clear, organized, transmitting on a schedule. A community center in Dublin, Ohio, 11 miles east. 47 survivors, 3 weeks established. A functional medical bay and a food supply from a restaurant supply warehouse they'd identified and cleared. The person transmitting was calm and specific, and was clearly doing so because they had decided that broadcasting their location was worth the risk of drawing attention, which meant they had assessed their security situation as stable enough to make the calculation. 16 people heard that transmission. The room's quality changed in a way I noticed physically. Not a sound, more a shift in the atmospheric pressure of a group of people who have been operating under one set of conditions and have just been handed the information that different conditions may be available. Ray said, 11 miles. Marcus said, we can't move Gwen more than 2 miles on foot without medical transport. Cam said, Harold can't do 11 miles on a walker. Lena said, then we don't move everyone. We send a contact team and negotiate a transfer with proper support. I had been thinking the same thing, and I recognized, not for the first time, that the room had been thinking with me in parallel since the day the first 3 people had come through the egress, that the 16-person entity we had become was functionally more intelligent than any single one of us, and that the intelligence was distributed across professional domains in a way that I had not designed and could not have. Paul said, I'll go. I know the surface. Danny said, I'll go with him. Lena looked at Danny. He looked back at her. They had a conversation in that exchange that I was not entirely able to read, but that ended with Lena nodding once. Not permission, exactly, and not agreement. Something more mutual. A recognition between 2 people who have decided to be honest about what they are to each other, even under conditions that argue against the addition of new emotional weight. We spent the rest of that day preparing. The contact team would carry documentation, a written summary of our group composition, medical needs, available skills, and current resource status. The kind of intake document that Beatrice recognized immediately and said looked like what she'd fill out for a new patient assignment, which meant it was the right form for what we were doing. I drafted it. My mother edited it with 4 precise corrections that improved it significantly. Darius reviewed it and suggested adding Priya's chemical expertise as a separate call-out, which was correct because that was the kind of skill a community with a medical bay would identify as high value. That evening, Sophie sat down beside me at the supply table. She had been talking more. Not much, not yet, but incrementally, in the way that the restoration of trust works. Slowly, then all at once. She looked at the documentation I'd prepared and said, "You're negotiating for us." I said, "Trying to." She said, "Are you going to tell them about the shelter? What you built?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why? You could just say you're a group of survivors." I said, "Because what I built here is useful to them. Because if I don't tell them the truth about what I am, I can't ask them to trust us." She looked at the document. Then she said, "Put my name on it." I said, "Your name?" She said, "On the list." I want to be on the list as a member of the group, not as a patient. I looked at her. 14 years old, with no family currently accounted for and no resources beyond what the shelter had provided her. She was asking to be counted as a contributor rather than a dependent, and the request was not wrong. She had contributed. She knew the shelter's geography better than most adults in the room. She kept watch at Cam's monitoring station with a patience and accuracy that he had noted and praised in his spare, factual way. I put her name on the list. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Thank you for asking." She looked at the document for another moment. Then she said, "You know, when you built this place, you thought you were building for yourself." She paused. "But you built it for all of us. You just didn't know we existed yet." I didn't answer. I wrote her name and added her skill note: observation, monitoring, spatial memory. Then I moved on to the next line. Paul and Danny left at 5:30 on day 28 and came back at 1400. They came back with 2 people from the Dublin Community Center. A woman named Tariq, who was the community's logistics coordinator, and a man named Fisher, who drove a modified cargo van and had made this kind of transit 6 times already for other groups, and who had the professional calm of someone operating competently at the edge of what's possible. Tariq walked through the shelter with the inventory eye of someone who had done intake assessments before and had specific criteria. She asked questions I recognized as the right questions, not the feel-good questions of someone performing assessment, but the structural questions of someone determining compatibility and resource contribution in a genuine integration calculus. She talked to Beatrice about Gwen's medical situation. She talked to Priya about the pharmaceutical resources. She talked to Cam, whose answers made her pause and then write something quickly in her notebook. She said to me, "You have 4 people here I consider high-priority assets for our community infrastructure. You understand what that means?" I said, "It means you want them regardless." She said, "It means I want all of you, but I want to be honest about what's driving that." I appreciated the honesty more than I could have explained to someone who hadn't spent 28 days learning to distinguish between people who were honest and people who were performing it. Fisher assessed the transit. Harold could ride in the van. Gwen could ride in the van. The rest would move on foot in 2 groups, with Fisher making 2 trips. He said the route was currently clear. He had driven it that morning, and that the timing window was approximately 4 hours before the afternoon movement patterns he'd observed became less predictable. We had 4 hours. The packing was fast because the shelter had been organized for exactly this kind of rapid transit from the day Beatrice had reorganized the medical section, and Marcus had fixed the egress, and Cam had integrated the power array. It was organized as though in preparation for a move, which it had been. Not consciously, not as a declared intention, but as the emergent property of 16 people who were all, in their individual domains, thinking about the next thing, even while doing the current one. I was the last person to leave. I had said I would be, and nobody had argued. And they had all understood why, without my having to say it. I went through the shelter one more time. Not a final check, because there was nothing left to check, but because I needed to see it empty. I needed to see the space I had built in the condition that made its full meaning available, which was not the condition of being occupied and functional, but the condition of being vacated and silent. The third bed, the supply shelves, still holding some of what I'd assembled, but depleted in the specific pattern of a system that had been used for its intended purpose. The ventilation port Marcus had identified as a weak point and repaired. The power integration Cam had designed and built. Priya's reorganized medical section. My mother's notepad, still on the sleeping platform with its amendments. I picked up the notepad. The last entry, added 2 days earlier in her handwriting, said, "This was never a shelter for two. You just hadn't met everyone yet." I folded it and put it in my jacket. I checked the secondary egress. Sealed, solid, Marcus's work holding as described. I looked at the room. Then I turned off the LED strips and went up through the egress into the November morning. Fisher was waiting at the yard line with the second group. Danny was at the front of it. He looked at me when I emerged and said nothing. Just watched me seal the egress behind me and straighten up and look at the direction we were going. Paul came to stand on my other side. The three of us walked east. 11 miles was not nothing. It was also not a wall. I told Tariq everything on the third day at the community center. The full timeline. The 14 months of data analysis. The supply calculation that had originally accounted for 2 people. The decision not to call my mother when I called Danny. The way I had revised every number, every margin, every methodology as each door had opened, until the original architecture of my intention was visible, only in the third bed I had built in 4 hours on the first night, and which Harold now slept in. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she said, "You're telling me this because you want me to know who you are." I said, "I'm telling you this because someone should have the full record." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because the calculation I built for 2 became the shelter that held 16. And I need that to be documented somewhere. Not as a success story, as information about what the math misses." She wrote it down. The whole thing. I don't know if what I did was right. I know that I built a door and kept opening it, and that each time I opened it, the room became more than I had designed for, and that the room held. What I built for myself became what 16 people survived in. I don't know what to do with that except write it down and keep it. So I did.